I will begin the recording. So before we started the webinar today, I wanted to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we work, meet and live on. I'm joining you from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I was actually looking out yesterday into my garden and I was like, I wonder what Noongar season it is, because it was just so beautiful and warm yesterday. And then I saw that it was warming Jilba, so that was really cool. My name's Roisin and I'm from the Relationships and Sexuality Education Project. So as you probably know, because you're attending our webinar, our project provides support for WA school staff in delivering comprehensive and evidence-based relationships and sexuality education. We're generously supported by the WA Health Growing and Developing Healthy Relationships program and Curtin University, who helped to make this webinar possible today. So we run a number of PD opportunities throughout the year, including two-day professional development workshops, 4 after-school webinars, and a biennial symposium, which can all be found on our websites and Humanitics page. We do have a community professional development day coming up in October. That's on the 21st and 22nd of October, and it is still free for teachers to attend that one as well. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to send us an email through. We also have a YouTube channel, so you'll find a bunch of recordings of prior after-school webinars, symposia, and also 2023 RSE Award nominee videos, which showcase some amazing examples of RSE implementation. So if you haven't already checked those out, they're a really good resource to have a look at. But for the next hour and 15 minutes, we're actually joined by our very own RSE Project Officer and PhD candidate, Hanna Saltis. I'm going to pass it over to Hanna now to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon. So I've titled this one Gender Inclusion in School Sport. I'm just going to share my screen. So I have a vested interest in gender inclusion, and I deliberately say gender inclusion and not trans inclusion because I think sport is one of those spaces that remains quite binary and exclusionary to a lot of people who don't fit into gender norms, regardless of whether they are cisgender or transgender. So just wanted to say that up front. So a bit about me. As Roisin said, I am a project officer on the RSE project. I have just gone past the halfway point of my PhD, where I'm exploring gender norms in women's community footy. I have a bunch of other titles and stuff that I leave on the slide, but really what I want to point out here is that I am a former and reformed sports hater. So I was the kid in PE who always had a note from my mum, who always had an excuse not to play. When I got my period, I was always the kid who was like, I have my period and I can't play like 6 months of the year. So this is from my older self to my younger self and to the teachers who might have been able to make sport a bit more appealing to me when I was younger. And now to preface that as well, when I was younger, I didn't know what non-binary was. I wasn't an out trans kid. I just thought I was a girl. So this is, with that in mind, that it's just not always about gender. It can be about other things as well that makes you feel like a little bit excluded from the sporting space. So hopefully this presentation, while it has a gender focus, can kind of give you some ideas about other things that you can be doing in your PE practice to make your sporting class, your PE class, like the most inclusive for the most people. I will be briefly discussing some potentially distressing content. So do whatever you need to do, pop away from the computer, have a break, mute me, log out, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself if you do find any of the content distressing at any time. So before I get started, I'm going to invite you to join this Slido. So if you just want to grab out your phones and scan the QR code, I will give you a couple of seconds to do that. And then I'm going to just move to this question on my Slido poll. And the question is, what makes a good game? So if you want to start answering that question, what makes a game sport fun? What makes it good? What makes it exciting? What makes people happy in a game of sport? Any sport. Yeah. What's it doing? I just want it to show me the results. Let's see if I can do that. All right, there we go. So collaborative effort, connection, non-competitive, winning, like yes, winning definitely can make it more fun. Pressure-free, healthy in terms of competition, but fun, camaraderie, friends, fun, like rules, yep. Engaging, lots of good stuff here that's like coming out. So I'm just going to get you to keep these things in mind because they're going to kind of ground our discussion a little bit later. So thank you. Feel good. Yep, 100%. All right. So starting with a little bit of terminology, just so that we're all on the same page. Oh, sorry, I have lost my PowerPoint from this end. Nope. Don't know what's happening there. There we go. Okay, so sex, just when I'm referring to sex, I'm talking specifically about those physical characteristics that we associate with sex, and not just external things, also hormones, chromosomes, and all those secondary sex characteristics that come in at puberty, which we often define by the appearance of the external genitals at birth. If I talk about sex assigned at birth, I'm literally just talking about whatever letter was put on the birth certificate. AMAB assigned male at birth and AFAB assigned female at birth. So that will become important when we're talking about intersex and trans people. Just noting that these terms are somewhat contested within the community, but they are very helpful for explaining what I'll be explaining. So I just thought give a little disclaimer on that. I'll be talking about intersex people, and intersex people are those who have sex characteristics that don't fit medical norms of female or male bodies. So there are 40 to 60 different variations of intersex variations, and a visual on that is the number of people in the world who have red hair, or if you put them all in one place, roughly the population of Russia. So I'll also be talking about gender, and gender is really distinct from sex in that it's about how you feel and how you want to be seen. It can align with your sex that was on your birth certificate, and if it does, then we refer to people like that as cisgender. And if it's different from the sex that's on your birth certificate, that is trans or transgender. And then I'll also be talking about non-binary identities, and they are gender identities that go beyond, outside of, or fluctuate between the binary of man and woman. So it's a gender, it's not a sex. And it's a very broad term. So just wanting to say that when I'm talking about non-binary people, I'll be talking about the broad definition of this. I'm not talking about it as a label. So if you want to brush up on any of these terms, I've left you a link here for the Pride in Sport terminology, and you can just Google any of the terms if you're unsure about them throughout the presentation as well. Okay, so I just wanted to start with some inclusive principles. So essentially, we have this taken from the WA HPE curriculum. And I just really wanted to highlight that embedded into the HPE curriculum is this respect for social justice principles. So it's not just about winning, it's not just about competition, it really has embedded in it this sort of social inclusion foundation. Sport Australia summed it up really nicely, talking about, I'll read the quote. Research amongst gender diverse young people tells us that mental health and wellbeing concerns for this group are substantial. So the power of sport to heal and reconcile and allow us to better understand each other's differences has never been more important. And I think that's something that sport really has done in my later life, has helped me to overcome differences, and really appreciate people's differences as well. And it's been quite an inclusive space for me in my later life. So I think it's a really nice thing to ground our practice in. Again, taken from the HPE WA ways of teaching, just noting here that inclusive practices, attitudes, values, and learning experiences are deeply embedded in assessment practices. So having the most amazing competition and isn't as important as assessing people's inclusive practices, or at least it's very much a part of it. So it's really important to embed that as much as you embed competition and sort of skills and all of that sort of stuff into your assessments. And lastly, I think I did go a bit wild on the inclusive principles slides, I have to admit. Community sports at the grassroots level is all about inclusion. That includes school sport, fitness, fun, and which should be welcoming of everyone, trans people included. And if you are excluding people, you need to make sure that you have done everything possible to show why that is and have given the person a chance to be included. So why we really have to make the case for exclusion rather than inclusion. Inclusion should be the default, and exclusion should be the thing that has to be justified, not the other way around. All right, so back to the old Slido. I just wanted to have a little bit of a brainstorm about what sort of gender roles and stereotypes and gender norms we've all heard of for boys and men. Yep. Faster, physical strength, machos, strong, stronger, more focused, definitely. But not just about sport as well, like what other things? Yeah, like aggression, like what other gender norms? Yeah, outlet, it's an outlet for aggression. Sport is masculine. Testosterone, sport is for boys. Dominant, not emotional. Yeah. Exclusive. Yeah, so it's a bit of a boys' club. more competitive than girls, yeah, or than any other gender. Absolutely. Okay, so basically, men who are good at sport tend to align closely with the stereotypes about men. As we saw, strength was a massive thing that people associate with men in sport, and that is seen as a really, oh, sorry, I forgot which camera I'm supposed to talk to. That is seen as a really masculine trait and a desirable trait for men to have. So if men are good at sports, we see that they are praised and they are, lauded in society for their abilities. All right, what about girls and women? Yeah, they've got to be petite, masculine features, strong, yep, weak, yep. There's a real dichotomy. Yeah, it's more for fun. It's not taken as seriously. Timid, yep. Quiet, soft, emotional, less athletic. Yep. So girls' sports, like they're completely different sports. Yeah, yep. Physically inferior, less athletic, fragile. Yep, they wear makeup, fitness, not worth as much. Yep, definitely. Like you see that in the even in the AFL, we get things where we have like less pay, less sponsorship, things like that, for sure. Yeah. All right, so yeah, there's no money at all. And they're sexualized. So yeah, things that we often see in women's sports. Oops. Yeah, common stereotypes, they're weak or uncoordinated, or they're good but for a girl, so it's qualified. Or they're lesbians and they align with those masculine traits and therefore they're not being good women. And then, yeah, completely opposite to the men, they don't align closely with feminine ideals, except for, as people pointed out, in those girl sports. So, gymnastics or artistic swimming, and if they're showing off their feminine form and they're being graceful and all of that sort of thing, all those sports that kind of try to account for femininity, then they will be praised. So unfortunately, the mechanics of sharing videos through webinars I don't have those skills at this point in my life. But I've included some links and you'll be able to access these slides later after the webinar. I'll get Rasheen to send those out for you a bit in the follow-up. And I've included heaps of links throughout. So I tried to collate a lot of resources. And there are some amazing campaigns. This 2014 North American campaign, Run Like a Girl. If you haven't seen the video, basically it's like all these women and getting asked to run like a girl, and they're doing all very silly things, and then they ask young girls to do it and they just run normally. And it's a bit of a tearjerker, so that's another reason I didn't play it, because I wouldn't be able to keep it together. But the message in it is really nice, so I highly recommend it, even Googling Run Like a Girl. And This Girl Can is an amazing Vic Health initiative that really highlights diversity in women's sports and normalizes doing sports at any age, in any body, at any stage of life. And is very culturally inclusive. It's a really lovely campaign, and I highly encourage you to go and check out the campaign, because the messages are really affirming. Okay. Last Slido, I promise. what about stereotypes for trans people in sport? Hold on, I think I have to go and activate that particular link. I might go to the wrong one. It's taking a second to load. Oh, there it is. All right. So yep, contentious, unfair, advantage, sad, confusing, cheating. Yep, absolutely. Pick a side, debate, lack of belonging, not sure where they sit, swapping gender to win. Yep. I did actually have a whole rant on that, but I took it out, but I will touch on that for sure. Yeah. So you can see that there's a lot less about the sport here and a lot more about fairness and inclusion, or exclusion more accurately here. So the other thing is that when we talk about trans people in sport, actually there's very little discussion about trans men in sport. It tends to be exclusively about trans women or non-binary people. So trans men in sport, often if they are even mentioned at all, which I haven't found many cases of it, it's fine. They're considered to be at a disadvantage, even though they're taking testosterone, which would be normally considered doping. So, you know, they have the range that they're allowed to take, which would be in the natural range. But regardless of whether they're taking testosterone, there is no real debate about whether trans men could be included in sport, because they are still considered weaker and smaller than cisgender men, which may or may not be true on an individual case-by-case basis. Non-binary people face some very specific kind of debate. So they're generally accepted if they're willing to compete in their assigned gender at birth categories and they're not taking any gender affirming hormones. So you will see a little bit more, usually assigned female at birth, non-binary people competing in competitions, usually in women's categories. And this is a type of erasure that means that non-binary people can't be seen as themselves or put themselves at risk of erasure and misgendering and all sorts of other things, just because they want to actually participate in sport, and they have been participating in sport for a long time, and they're, you know, elite athletes and that sort of thing. So really, the main focus of any debate around trans inclusion in sport is around trans women. And as we pointed out, there are a number of myths. Well, there was some discussion, but there are some big myths around trans women's inclusion in sport. So, for example, one of the myths that I've come across is that biological sex is the biggest advantage in sport. But actually, there is very little research out there to say that this is the case. Oftentimes, particularly when we're talking about elite sports, elite athletes are not tested, and the variables are not adequately narrowed down to say this is the biggest thing. There will be suggestions that it might be a contributing factor, but there are many other contributing factors that might have more of a bearing on someone's sports performance. For example, access to like training, access to equipment, and, you know, various other things, height, weight, which may be related to gender, but it also may be related to other things like person's background, like ethnicity, etc. So there are many, many factors that come into this biological sex being the biggest advantage in sports performance. And it is quite essentialist, and the evidence doesn't seem to support this very clearly. Again, the fact that all trans women have an unfair advantage over cis women is completely unfounded. Trans people, just like cis people, have a lot of diversity within their community. Cis women also have a lot of diversity within their community. It will also depend on the sport that we're talking about. You know, something like gymnastics, for example, may not be advantageous for trans women to compete in. It just depends on the trans person, on the sport, and on the other competitors. And every cohort is quite diverse regardless. I did want to go back to that point of people will swap genders to compete. It's actually such a process to transition, and usually the sports guidelines around transitioning will be that they needed to have transitioned for 2 years, take those gender affirming hormones, and be in consultation with a range of medical professionals, and have been testing constantly over the 2-year period for your to see whether your hormones are in line with those that are acceptable to whatever sporting body you're trying to compete with. So swimming will have different rules to football, will have different rules to tennis, etc. So it's actually not a very easy process to do. So I don't think a lot of men would be really wanting to take testosterone suppressing hormones and estrogen in order to swap categories and compete as a woman. There's just not that there are so many reasons that argument is completely fallible, that I don't have heaps of time to get into, but that's from a very superficial perspective, that it's just not a realistic thing. Most people, cis and trans, want to be viewed as the gender that they feel themselves to be. So I don't think that many cisgender men would be wanting to be seen as a woman. It just doesn't make sense at all. Okay, what else have I got here? So yeah, again, that diversity, the fact that trans people are not all the same, and that we are normally talking about trans women, and so definitely when we're talking about trans inclusion and exclusion, we can't be homogenizing these groups, because trans people will come in all gender variations basically. And it's not just harmful for trans people to start policing the kinds of ways that femininity, policing femininity. We saw recently in the Amani Khalif incident at the Olympics, how a cisgender woman who didn't fit into gender stereotypes of those feminine, weak, soft, all of those kind of adjectives that you used in the previous slide. A woman who didn't look like that, who is cisgender, was called into question and absolutely harassed and abused online by very prominent figures because she didn't fit into those stereotypes. So by trying to police trans people, it automatically filters into policing cisgender people who also don't fit into those stereotypes. And definitely this can intersect with different cultural backgrounds and different kinds of values that people have in their families and in their broader cultures as well. So by trying to police trans people, we're actually trying to harm more people. Sorry, not trying to harm more people. By trying to police trans people, we are doing harm to all people, because we're starting to narrow the categories of what is acceptable, which feels like a bit of a regression to where we have come to in terms of gender equality and gender diversity as well and inclusion, you know, since the Sex Discrimination Act and, you know, more recent marriage equality and all of that. There's been a lot of progress made, and this feels like going backwards a little bit. And so then intersex people, not many people will know that they're intersex as well. Some people don't know that they're intersex until they start participating in sport, and then people think it's unfair, and then they have to go through gender testing, which is a really exclusionary and discriminatory practice. Many intersex people actually want to compete as the sex they were assigned at birth. A lot of intersex people actually do identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, and they may have grown up and been socialized into that sex and gender, and then being told you can't compete, you're not a real whatever gender they are. Actually, similar to trans people, there are many, many rules for intersex women competing in sport, and none for intersex men. So it's a bit distinct from participation as like for trans women, because intersex people with women with intersex variations never sought to transition or change their sex classification. They just want to compete as they have been raised. So there's lots and lots of information about that. I highly recommend reading about Caster Semenya's case, and also going to the Intersex Human Rights Sports page for more information on that. So why are we even talking about gender stereotypes? So it's really important because they're internalized very early on, between 4 and 6 years old, and endorsing gender stereotypes is linked to the perpetration of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, and these issues affect all people, but most people, disproportionately affect trans people. So I've included a bunch of links there for you to go and follow up on this if you want. But basically, we know that the stronger people endorse those gender stereotypes, the more likely they are to be perpetrators of violence and be exclusionary in other ways as well. And, you know, it impacts all sorts of things. So it impacts things from subject choices, to achievement, you know, setting their own achievements, their career choices, their self-esteem, and well-being and mental health. And that's for all genders. So they're quite foundational to how we think about and conceptualize our place in the world. And I included this little quote up here in the orange, about the organisation lifting limits in the UK. And it really points to how teachers are really fundamental in helping to challenge these gender norms and to not reinforce them in our classrooms. But as I said earlier, sport can also be a fantastic place to challenge these sorts of societal exclusionary policies and things like that, and to really be a place to reconcile and heal. And a beautiful study that I found was this one called Coaching Boys into Men, which was a 2.5-year study where the coach delivered respectful relationships education to about 1,000 boys aged between 11 and 14. And then 86% of those students completed a follow-up. And what they found was that this program, which was delivered through sports, like in a football club, by the coach, who was a trusted person, the messages were really still very strong 1 year on. And they saw that these young men were much more endorsed positive bystander behaviours or upstanding behaviours because they were more active in the in challenging their friends about, you know, these degrading norms about women or ways that they were treating their girlfriends and that kind of thing. They had more equitable gender attitudes, so they were really, you know, seeing that boys and girls could do the same thing and had the same abilities. And then they also demonstrated a lower level of adolescent relationship abuse than the control group. So this is still quite strong at a year's follow-up, and this was delivered in a sporting setting. So if we can harness the power of sport for good, then we can actually start to really change these norms and create much safer places, both on the field and at home and in young people's relationships as well. So this is basically what we actually know about trans inclusion in sport. Biological arguments, by and large, are not well supported and are often refuted. They don't have a lot of comparative or longitudinal studies. So if they're looking at trans people, they might have just taken a random sample of trans people. They're usually quite small samples, and they won't distinguish between elite and non-elite populations, and they won't compare elite and non-elite populations because it may well be that something different happens in the bodies of elite sports people. We also know that there are a lot of policies that are around to try and facilitate the inclusion of fair inclusion of trans and gender diverse people, but they're not very good, and then they don't seem to be based in actual evidence. They seem to be based in biological essentialist understandings of what gender actually is. And the rules are very different from sport to sport and at different levels. So it's all a bit all over the place at the moment, and we kind of need to try and start bringing it all together. But that's not your job as teachers. What we know for teachers, that's all about the elite level of sport, and we want to bring it into the classroom. So we want to zoom in a little bit. What we do know is that there are lower levels in lifelong participation for trans and gender diverse people. That means that after school and going through life as we age, where we want to be more active, where we want to have these healthy habits, trans and gender diverse people have less access and lower levels to that. We also know that community and school sport participation have huge mental, physical, emotional, and psychological benefits. That's just the case for all sports at the community and school sport level. And we also know that inclusion in sport is a human right. So remembering what I said at the start, inclusion is the default and exclusion is the thing that we need to be justifying. And I just really thought that this young person's quote from a recent study called Free to Exist spoke volumes. So I feel like it needs to be happening, like teachers need to be taught, like when we're having PE and we're running around running sports lesson, how to conduct those in a way that isn't reaffirming these weird ideas about gender or being reductive or potentially harmful to any queer people that might not realize they are in their class. And I think that's the biggest thing, because I think if you start young feeling included in those spaces, stepping into those spaces as an adult is a lot less scary. So as I said, well, as I've kind of alluded to, trans and non-binary inclusion in school sport really boils down to two questions. Is it fair for the cisgender people that transgender people are participating? This is what people's concerns are, I should say. So is it fair, and will cis people be injured, and will they be outcompeted? And where do I put the non-binary people in my class? How do we segregate them if we're basing it on gender, where do I put them? But these questions could actually be reframed. And I think that the first question really could be reframed to be, what is the cost of excluding trans people from sport? If we know that they have massive physical, mental, psychological, emotional benefits, then if we're excluding them, then what are we actually doing? We're actually perpetuating exclusion, and we're perpetuating harm. Rather than, is it fair? We could say instead, how can we make it fair for everyone to compete? And how can we segregate in our classes that, like, in a way that's not based on gender? We segregate based on gender often just because it's one of the easiest things to do, but there are so many other ways that we can be separating our classes out. Also, I just wanted to point out that trans and non-binary people make up a relatively small proportion of the class, and young trans people who identify as trans women are an even smaller percentage. So we're not asking you to move mountains, we're asking you to accommodate a few different people. But really it's also positive because a lot of people who aren't participating in sports are not saying that it's because they feel excluded based on gender. So it might be that they're not feeling confident for other reasons. Maybe they're not feeling confident in their bodies, or they don't have equipment to affirm their gender while they're playing sports. So things like binders and that kind of thing. So it's quite a complicated and nuanced topic. So we're just trying to get to a place where everyone can play and everyone feels included. So instead of asking those questions that we were asking before, maybe we can ask things like, what is the goal for your class? How do the rules that you come up with support fairness and inclusion? Is it more important to compete or have fair play? What do you do when you have a superstar in the class? So for me, when I was growing up, there were lots of people who were actually good at sport in the class, and it made me feel intimidated to play. It was nothing to do with my gender. It was the fact that I didn't feel like I was as good in the class. And my partner told me a hilarious story. So he was, slight brag, on the interstate team when he was in primary school. And maybe in his early high school years, he was playing T-ball in school sport, and he did I say baseball or basketball? I meant T-ball. So he was playing T-ball in a group of his class, and one of the in his mind he was like, I'm going to hit this ball so good and I'm going to get a home run and it's going to be fantastic. And the pitcher threw the ball, and she wasn't particularly good at T-ball. She'd never really played before, and she threw the ball and he hit it back into her face because he hit an objectively good ball, but she wasn't skilled to catch the ball and wasn't skilled to say, I have to move out of the way of this fast ball that's coming at my face. So everyone in the class was like really upset with him because he'd hit this girl in the face, and so he didn't get the fame and the glory that he really, really wanted. So how do you manage those kinds of discrepancies? It's not just gender that we're trying to do. We're trying to manage different skill sets, different experiences, different values, and trying to make it so that everyone can be included. What about people who don't play sport outside of school at all? You're going to be dealing with, as I said, a very different skill set. And, you know, what about kids who just don't really enjoy sport, particularly thinking about young boys who don't enjoy sport and aren't fitting into that gender norm and who don't feel confident to play and might get teased if they're not as skilled as their other male peers. Like, there are just so many issues going on that we need to be asking broader questions about inclusion and not just focusing on people's gender. And also, what is your school doing to support LGBTQIA+ people in general? And how does your school's policy protect you or help you to maybe develop some more inclusion policies around specific LGBTQIA+ and gender inclusion. All right. Oh yes. And going back to what makes a good game, which if we look at what the answers that you put there for the first thing, it was mostly about fun, fairness, inclusion, connection, all of those things. So how does your classroom foster that kind of spirit? How does your classroom make it so that, apologies. How does your classroom make it so that you are creating the most fun, the most connected, best game that you can? So if we just go back to those foundations, maybe they're better guiding questions than how do I include the 1 or 2 trans people in the class? If you're doing this, then you will automatically, hopefully, be including them. And the curriculum, particularly in WA, I'm not really across the other states' curriculums. So if you're from another state, I do apologise. But how can we tie in other really critical aspects into PE? So we can go beyond the physical activity and the movement. And, you know, we also need to be like looking at the different and changing needs for kids throughout. So they're going to have different performance like before, during and after puberty and at different phases of the menstrual cycle, for example. And we can use the curriculum to really support people in learning about respectful relationships and consent and self-care and personal safety and sleep and nutrition. All of these can be much more important factors, I feel, than gender in making someone have a good time, feel included, or be good and competitive at sport. If someone's not having a great time at home, if someone's not sleeping well, if someone's nutrition is poor, then they're probably less likely to be having a good time when they're playing sport. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I did take the liberty of going through the entire HPE curriculum and then highlighting all of the ways that you can embed inclusion in PE from the broader HPE curriculum. The ways that I identified here, dealing with bullying and harassment and challenging disrespect and discrimination, ways in which inappropriate emotional responses impact on relationships. So kind of getting, you know, people who are getting aggressive to moderate and to understand how aggressive behavior on the field can have impacts on relationships off the field. And then looking at circumstances that can influence the level of responses. Are you winning? You're probably going to be more happy. Are you losing? You're probably going to be sadder. But what does it mean overall? And that starts from year 3, but you can introduce it in an age-appropriate way early on as well. Here, there's a lot of, in the like upper the lower secondary school, there's a lot of stuff to do with respectful relationships and empathy, emotional intelligence, emotional literacy. And so you can really like build that into your PE by, you know, trying to reinforce these things. How good is the communication between players? How much are people respecting each other's gender on and off the field? How would you feel if you're in that situation? Building empathy, looking at power and coercion, and how that actually is influenced by gender stereotypes, using any of those gendered interactions as teachable moments, because they will inevitably crop up And they might crop up in ways that aren't so explicit. It might be someone being like, oh, you run like a girl, or like, oh, what does that actually mean? What is the stereotype of a girl? Do you see any girls running like that right now? Just that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be like full lesson plans. It can just be those subtle reinforcing messages that we give, as they come up. And then I just loved this, and I thought, we really don't have to wait till year 7 to 10 to start talking about these. Modification of rules and equipment and scoring systems to allow fair play, safety, and inclusion of all participants. It's in the curriculum at year 8, but really it could be in there from year 1. I've been watching a lot of Paralympics. I'm a bit of an Olympics nut. And the Paralympics is the embodiment of this kind of thing. There are so many sports in the Paralympics that have modified rules to be inclusive. And I think looking at how we include people with disabilities in sport can really give us a foundation to make our whole practice more inclusive. So I'll leave that there because I could go on another long tangent, and I believe we're running short of time. So all of those physical things can be really, really important, but I really wanted to highlight here that feeling safe and fitting in is equally important to things like having appropriate sports environments, and also, correct changing rooms and all of that kind of stuff. So to do that, I created a little bit of a list for you. So of course we can start by looking at our structural barriers, change rooms, uniforms, affirming gender gear, like gender affirming gear, like binders, that kind of thing. Using inclusive language is just always a top tip for gender inclusion, especially for people who don't necessarily, haven't necessarily started their gender journey yet. But it is just inclusive of everyone. Something that I definitely noticed, and I definitely notice as a non-binary person participating in social sport, is that when someone says great work team or great work everyone, I'm like, oh, that's me. But if someone says good work ladies, I'm like, oh, well, that's like just not me. So I guess I didn't do a good job. And it's very quiet. It's a very quiet voice in the back of my mind, but it's there. Calling out transphobia, homophobia, and sexism in class and on the field. So if you hear someone saying like, oh, that's so gay, or, you run like a girl in a derogatory way, really like picking that up and talking about it. And yeah, not just on the field, not just in your sports class, but any time that you hear that in the playground or in the classroom. Creating social cohesion and having tasks that focus on building relationships. So something that we do at the RSE project is that we constantly swap people in and out of groups. So at any point, you will have to work with different people from your class or from your training group in our cases. And we really like to make people work with a range of different people. So we try not to keep them in the same groups. And this really focuses on building relationships. And by building relationships, we make it less likely that someone is going to be excluded, because if we have strong relationships between everyone in the class, and that's not always going to be possible, but if we can make it so that at least they have empathy for another person in the class, even if they're not particularly inclined to like them, then we can teach all those other things like, getting along. We want people to be able to go into the adult world and be able to get along with people that they don't necessarily want to be friends with or want to like. So by being able to build these relationships and create social cohesion, you actually are setting them up for many more skills, just like even beyond sport. Modifying rules for inclusion. So, I recently joined an AFL 9s team. It's mixed team. We have lots of different rules so that everyone can get a kick of the ball. For example, there was a message in the group chat the other day that was like, not everyone's had as much experience kicking and marking. So instead of like, we'll pay a mark even if somebody is maybe drops the ball or who's less experienced. And also we will reduce there's no minimum kicking distance because a lot of people are less accurate over a long distance. So we'll just let people kick as far as they feel comfortable to, so that they're actually able to practice their kicking skills. And let's try and pass to the people who aren't necessarily confident to mark the ball, because we'll pay those marks. So that encourages like the more experienced players to kick to the less experienced players and give them practice, just because they're not worried that they're gonna like lose the ball for a turnover because it's not got caught by someone who's really experienced and not marked properly. So, you know, we're not going to build skills by having all the really good people in the class kick to each other and then the other people who aren't as confident not getting a touch of the ball. So even things like 5 different people must have touched the ball before someone attempts to score. Just things like that where, you know, you're making the rules a little bit more inclusive. They're not so focused on the competition, like fastest person down the, you know, track wins. It's like someone who has like gone to 5 different people and given them the ball, or they've passed the baton to 5 different people, or whatever have you. Mixing up my sports there, but whatever. That's fun. You can create your own sports too. The sky's the limit. Having mixed ability teams as well. So pairing those not so strong students with the students who are stronger, getting them to really like, you know, show off their expertise, but in a way that's encouraging of others, so that they feel like they've contributed and it's not just all about them winning. They can be like, oh, this person who I told them a little tip or trick, they did that tip or trick and then they scored a goal, or they passed the ball where before they would have dropped the ball. Splitting classes by something other than gender, alphabetical order, split in half, random count-offs. We have numerous grouping strategies in the RSE project. If you want any tips on grouping your classes, please get in touch with us. We will talk your ear off about grouping. Selecting novel sports, or sports that will be less likely to give an advantage to some. So if you're doing footy, you've likely got like 4 or 5 like people on the team who play footy on the weekends, and they're going to have a great time. And then everyone else, like coming into AFL as a 30-year-old and trying to kick a ball could have been quite a demoralizing experience, except that I had lovely teammates who were very, very encouraging and really, really supportive of the fact that I've never played footy in my life. So, you know, trying to pick novel sports that maybe not everyone has those skills, or is not going to advantage some people over others. Or as I said, make your own sport. My favorite Paralympic sport is goalball, which I thought, wow, that sounds like someone who didn't know what sport was, and they were like, goalball. But there is no able-bodied equivalent, and basically it was created to rehabilitate blind veterans after World War II, and then was a demonstration sport in the Olympics, and then it was like officially included in the Olympics not maybe in the 60s or 70s, and then women had got their own team in the 80s for the Olympic sports. And as I said, there's no able-bodied like equivalent, and this was just an exercise that some people developed to rehabilitate blind veterans, and it's now an Olympic sport. So you never know what school sport that you make up that's super inclusive could make it to the Olympics. And then rewarding personal bests and encouraging students to do that for themselves and their peers. So don't be beating yourself up if you can't beat the fastest runner in the class. Did you do 1 second better? Did you do half a millisecond better? who cares? You did better and you have developed in your own abilities, which is awesome. And having students really celebrating that for their peers as well just creates a much more inclusive environment. So being their ally, trying to just make sure you're on their side, you're going to be there to support them if they're struggling. You're going to make an effort to make sure that they don't have to struggle. I think that's my main thing. People do notice, young people notice if you call out homophobia, transphobia and sexism. People notice if you're making an effort to have more inclusive sports. Don't think that even if your students don't approach you and thank you for it, they definitely have noticed and they will definitely carry those skills into later life. That's a summing up slide. My main takeaways would probably be striving towards designing a good game based on what we put in the Slido. And yeah, going back to the curriculum, and I've listed so many resources throughout this presentation. And as I said, you'll get the slides, so like go through those, and always feel free to reach out to the RSE project if you want more ways to include trans people and people of all genders in general or in PE. That's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions. If you could come on camera or mic, because that would be fantastic if you have any questions, comments, queries.
Hannah, I have a question. You said to
Yes,
come out of the
Giselle,
mic, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah, I have a question. Absolutely fantastic presentation
Thanks, Giselle.
on a subject that I don't know a lot about. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on something like an open category being added to sports? I'm going to go off camera now.
No, don't. I love feeling like I'm talking to you. Open categories. Yeah, look, open categories have not been super successful. I think that's for two reasons. As I said, there aren't that many trans and non-binary participants, right? So if you're putting an open category, people who are likely to select into the open category would be more likely to be trans or non-binary, I would suggest. And if it's not that many people, then they're going to be like, well, we don't have enough people to race in that category. So it would be not just having an open category, but encouraging people of all genders to go into the open category and then trying to formulate rules around how to police that. So I think it's quite a complicated thing. I don't think it's as straightforward as being like, have an open category, because there are going to be like different administrative and bureaucratic things that sort of govern how successful that is. So instead of doing that, I would probably be more of a proponent for making the rules more inclusive in the categories that we have, and maybe not. I don't have a perfect solution. Open categories could definitely work in some, but you would need some dedicated people to dedicate some time and thought, and that's just not something that I think a lot of PE teachers have, unfortunately. So if people have a wellbeing team or they have thoughts about how they would create an open category, I would love to hear them, because I think it's a good option. I just don't think it's often done well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I suppose I was asking in response to the discourse, which is obviously very heightened at the moment, post-Olympics and during the Olympics, and I was wondering if that was a way to get around it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think it could be. I think the other thing about open categories is they're not very enduring and people give up on them very quickly. So I would love to see a sorry, I just got distracted by a question in the thing. I would love to see some long-term implementation strategies for creating open categories, particularly at that elite level. And in the school sector, I think it's probably not going to have I don't think it's going to be the best method in the school sector, I think. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Giselle. Kim, if you could make up an inclusive sport, what would it be? Oh, I have no idea. I'm not that, like, as I said, I'm a reformed sports hater. So I only know about AFL, netball, volleyball. That's 3. That's more than I thought I would get to. I only know ball sports, it seems. But yeah, I love that question. I'm going to think on that and I'll get back to you. Do you have any tips for supporting conversations with people who don't agree with or have strong opinions about trans folks in sports? Yes, I do. I have lots of tips about that. My main tip would be listening to them and asking questions about their specific reservations and trying to understand what they're actually concerned about, what they're probably more the thing is, and I actually want to comment on the fact that you've called out boomers, because I know for a fact that there are many boomers who don't have an issue with trans inclusion in sport. I have a lot of personal family experience with thinking that people would be one way and they actually were a completely different way. And it's a lot of young people also are resistant to inclusion about trans folk in sport. So I don't want to create that age divide. And I would say try not to go in with those assumptions based on age and based on generation that people will automatically be exclusionary or not agree with including trans people in sports. The only way to move forward with this conversation is to make people's concerns heard and validated. Even if they're not particularly valid, you want them to feel like you've heard them, you've considered what they've said, and then you present them with like an alternative. But if you go in defensively, they're much, much less likely to listen to you. And I think, yeah, they're my main 2 tips. Try to put your assumptions in a box and approach them in good faith. And then if people are not responding in good faith, then trying to understand what exactly their issue might be. I don't know, there are some other really well-qualified people in the group that I can see who might want to comment on that. Is there anyone I could throw that out to the group for some tips about that? Kim, cough, cough, Kim. Not to put you on the spot.
I thought that was you putting me on the spot.
No, you don't have to answer, but if you did have anything to contribute, I would be very I would welcome your thoughts.
My only thing I was going to say is I've noticed that when it comes to these conversations, it is held a lot like it is a debate.
Totally.
And so I think it's really important to kind of lay it on the line that yes, they can have concerns. Yes, we can discuss those concerns, but the reality is not a debate. Like these people exist regardless. And so that's my, that is my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Kim. I knew you'd have something good to contribute there. Yeah, as I said at the start and throughout, you must be making inclusion the default. It's not a debate. Inclusion is not a debate. If there is a legitimate reason that we would be excluding someone, that needs to be extremely explicitly stated, and it can't be based on well, what if? It can't be like hypotheticals. It needs to be based on something tangible. Thank you for your comment, Hannah. I was really excited to see that you popped in for this one. Were there any other questions? Otherwise, I will put my RSE hat on and ask you all to do an evaluation. I'll give you like another 30 seconds. Thanks, Giselle. All right, if there are no other questions. Thanks, Heidi. I love that. If there are no other questions, please take 2 to 5 minutes to do this survey and rate me so that we know whether this was useful for you. And then we can continue to include or change our, practices to better meet the needs of our lovely RSE people. Thanks, Maggie. I appreciate that. Once you've done your evaluation, you're free to go. I'll hang around until everyone's kind of gone, and just in case anyone wants to ask any other questions.